A lonely elderly woman in a remote cabin found a severely injured gray wolf in the snow. Everyone said she should have left it to die. But what happened when the predator awoke would change both their lives forever. This is a story of unexpected healing, second chances, and a bond that transcends the divide between human and wild. Get ready for an emotional journey that will remind you of nature's most profound mysteries. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. Margaret Wilson had lived alone in her cabin on the edge of the northern forest for nearly 20 years since her husband's passing. At 78, most people her age had moved to retirement communities or in with their children, but Margaret had always been different. The isolation suited her, and the harsh Montana winters kept her company in a way that people never could. On this particular January morning, the thermometer outside her kitchen window read 15 degrees below zero. The first major blizzard of the season had dumped nearly 3 feet of snow overnight, transforming the landscape into a pristine white wilderness. Margaret pulled her worn wool cardigan tighter and sipped her tea, gazing out at the endless expanse of white. She had just finished feeding her chickens when she noticed something unusual at the edge of the tree line, a dark shape disrupting the perfect blanket of snow. Through her old binoculars, she could make out what appeared to be an animal, motionless against the white backdrop. Probably a deer that didn't make it through the night, she muttered to herself, reaching for her walking stick. Though her arthritic knees protested, Margaret had always believed in facing the harsh realities of nature directly. The trek through the deep snow took nearly 20 minutes, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. As she approached, Margaret realized it wasn't a deer at all, but something that made her heart skip a beat, a massive gray wolf, its fur matted with blood on one side, half buried in the snow. In all her years living on the edge of the wilderness, she had heard the wolves, but rarely seen them. The wolf's massive size surprised her. Easily over 100 pounds, with a thick winter coat of silver and gray. "Poor creature," she whispered, maintaining a safe distance. As she observed from several feet away, she noticed the shallow rise and fall of its rib cage. The wolf was alive, but barely. Margaret could see the source of its distress, a grotesque metal trap clamped around its back leg, the jaws of the device crusted with frozen blood. Illegal trapping still happened in these remote parts, despite the laws protecting wolves. The animal had apparently dragged itself this far before collapsing from blood loss and exhaustion. The sensible thing, Margaret knew, was to call Fish and Wildlife Services. Yet when the wolf's eyes suddenly opened, piercing amber orbs that locked onto her with an intensity that froze Margaret in place, something passed between them. There was pain in those eyes, certainly, but something else too. Something that struck Margaret as hauntingly familiar. The wolf made no move to growl or threaten. It simply watched her, its breath creating small puffs in the cold air between them. "You're waiting to die, aren't you?" Margaret whispered. With a determination that belied her age, she made a decision that defied all reason. "Well, not on my watch, you won't," she said firmly. "Not today." Margaret hurried back to her cabin as quickly as her aging legs would carry her. Inside, she gathered an old sled for hauling firewood, thick leather gloves, blankets, and her late husband's rifle as a precaution. In her medicine cabinet, she found the veterinary first aid kit she kept for her chickens. Her mind raced with doubt. What she planned was dangerous and foolish for a woman her age. The sensible option was calling authorities, yet something in the wolf's eyes had awakened a determination she hadn't felt in years. "You're being ridiculous," she scolded herself. "That's a wild predator, not some stray dog." Despite her doubts, she added hydrogen peroxide, antibiotic ointment, and bandages to her supplies. She also packed bolt cutters to remove the trap. Upon returning, the wolf remained conscious, its amber eyes following her movements. The animal made no attempt to rise, confirming it was too weak to pose an immediate threat. "I'm going to help you," she said firmly, "but you have to work with me." Keeping a respectful distance, Margaret laid out a blanket beside the wolf. With extraordinary care, she approached from behind. The wolf's ears twitched, but it remained still. Margaret's hands trembled as she assessed the trap. It was barbaric, its metal teeth piercing deeply into the wolf's hind leg. The sight filled her with anger. "This is going to hurt," she warned softly, positioning the bolt cutters. "But it's the only way." With surprising strength, Margaret squeezed the handles. The trap's mechanism groaned, then gave way. The wolf let out a pained yelp but didn't lunge or bite. Instead, it watched her with those intelligent eyes. Removing the trap's jaws from the wolf's flesh was difficult. Margaret worked slowly, murmuring soothing words as she gently pried the metal teeth free. Blood flowed once the pressure released, and Margaret quickly applied pressure with a clean cloth. "You need proper care," she told the wolf as she wrapped the leg. "But first we need to get you somewhere warm." The challenge came in moving a 100-pound predator onto her sled. Margaret positioned it close to the injured animal and took a deep breath. "We're going to do this together," she said firmly. "I'm asking you to trust me." To her amazement, the wolf remained passive as she carefully rolled him onto the blanket and then onto the sled. Whether from weakness or some inexplicable understanding, the predator allowed her to move him without resistance. Pulling the laden sled through a deep snow exhausted Margaret. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her muscles screaming in protest. By the time they reached her cabin, she was completely spent. She arranged more blankets into a makeshift bed in her mudroom, positioning it with a separate exit should the wolf become dangerous. After providing water and ensuring the animal was comfortable, Margaret collapsed into her kitchen chair, hands shaking. "What have I done?" she whispered. "What am I going to do with a wolf in my mudroom?" 3 days passed in a blur of anxiety and hope. Margaret converted her mudroom into a makeshift veterinary ward, using a baby gate as a barrier. The wolf remained mostly motionless except for his breathing, occasionally opening those amber eyes to track her movements. Margaret had gained some veterinary knowledge from years of rural living, enough to clean the wound properly, apply antibiotics, and create a proper bandage. She'd also crushed one of her own antibiotics into raw meat she offered the animal. "You need a name," she told him on the second morning. "I can't keep calling you Wolf." "How about Grayson? Seems fitting." Grayson merely watched her with those unnerving eyes that seemed to understand far more than any wild animal should. On the third day, Margaret faced a difficult reality as her supplies dwindled. She needed to go into town, which meant leaving the wolf alone for at least 3 hours. The nearest store was 15 miles away on treacherous roads. "I have to go out," she explained to Grayson. "Please don't destroy my mudroom while I'm gone." The trip was nerve-wracking, not just because of icy roads, but because of constant worry about what she might find upon returning. Would the wolf become dangerous? Would he escape? At the general store, Margaret purchased more meat, bandages, and veterinary supplies under the guise of caring for her chickens. Old Jim Harper, who ran the store, raised an eyebrow. "Something wrong with your chickens, Maggie?" "Just being prepared," she replied casually. "This winter's going to be a harsh one." "You know," Jim said, leaning forward, "Bill Thompson said he spotted wolf tracks near his property yesterday. First time in years. You be careful out there, all alone." Margaret nodded noncommittally. Did Jim suspect something? The drive home was tense, with Margaret constantly checking her rearview mirror, expecting to see a fish and wildlife truck following her. What she was doing wasn't just dangerous. It was likely illegal. As she pulled up to her cabin, relief washed over her upon finding everything as she had left it. Inside, she hurried to the mudroom, heart pounding. Grayson was awake, his head raised at the sound of her entry. For a breathtaking moment, woman and wolf regarded each other. Then, to Margaret's astonishment, the wolf's tail moved, not quite a wag, but a deliberate sweep across the blanket. "Well, hello to you too," she said, emotion making her voice unsteady. "Looks like you are feeling better." That evening brought another milestone. For the first time, Grayson accepted food directly from Margaret's hand, a piece of raw chicken offered on a long wooden spoon. His acceptance represented a tentative trust beginning to form. Later, as Margaret read by lamplight, she heard a soft whine. Approaching cautiously, she found Grayson attempting to stand, his injured leg buckling. "Easy there," she soothed, instinctively reaching toward him. To her surprise, Grayson did not growl. Instead, he stretched his massive head forward, just enough for his nose to make brief contact with her fingertips before settling back onto his blanket. That small gesture brought unexpected tears to Margaret's eyes. Something profound had passed between them, transcending the natural boundaries between human and wild. 2 weeks passed, transforming both Margaret's home and routine. The gate remained open as Grayson proved not to be a threat. His wound was healing cleanly, and he had begun putting weight on the injured leg. Margaret's fear had given way to genuine affection. She found herself talking to Grayson constantly, sharing memories of her late husband Robert, and reading aloud in the evening. "Robert would think I've lost my mind," she told Grayson one afternoon as she knitted by the fire, the wolf resting nearby. "Having a wolf as a houseguest wasn't in our retirement plans." Grayson tilted his head, those intelligent eyes fixed on her with what seemed like understanding. That night, a fierce storm hit the mountains. Wind howled around the cabin, rattling the windows. Margaret woke to a crash from her back porch. Grabbing her flashlight, she discovered a fallen tree had smashed through the porch roof. "It's just a tree," she told Grayson, who had appeared beside her, alert and tense. "We'll deal with it in the morning." As Margaret turned to go back to bed, she heard men's voices carrying through the storm. Poachers occasionally ventured into these remote areas during bad weather, knowing rangers wouldn't patrol. "We should check that cabin," a gruff voice called. "Might have supplies worth taking." Margaret's heart raced. Isolated as she was, with phone lines down in the storm, she was vulnerable. She reached for her husband's shotgun, but knew at 78 she stood little chance against multiple intruders. Grayson sensed the danger. His posture changed completely, ears forward, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Before Margaret could stop him, he slipped through the dog door she'd installed for his freedom. "Grayson, no," she whispered urgently. Outside, she heard startled shouts, followed by the sound of men running. Then silence, broken only by the continuing storm. Minutes later, Grayson returned, shaking snow from his coat. There was no blood on him, no sign of violence, yet the men had fled. His mere presence, a full-grown gray wolf emerging from darkness, had been enough. Margaret sank to her knees, wrapping her arms around the wolf's thick neck before she could consider the wisdom of such an action. Grayson stood perfectly still, allowing the embrace. "You protected me," she whispered against his fur. That night, instead of returning to his bed in the mudroom, Grayson settled on the rug beside Margaret's bed. As she drifted back to sleep, she realized something profound had shifted. The wild animal she had saved had chosen to become her protector. Spring arrived in the mountains, melting the snow and transforming the landscape. With it came a difficult realization for Margaret. Grayson had recovered completely. His magnificent strength had returned, and his wild nature called to him. She would see him staring out windows, watching deer in the distant meadow, his body tense with instinctual desire. "You need to return to where you belong," Margaret told him one morning, her voice breaking despite her resolve. "I always knew this day would come." 3 months had passed since she'd found him in the snow. 3 months of extraordinary companionship that had changed them both. Grayson had become so integrated into her life that the thought of his absence left an ache in her chest. That afternoon, Margaret hiked with Grayson to the edge of the forest, 5 miles from her cabin. It was time. A wolf belonged in the wild, not confined to an old woman's home, no matter how deep their connection. "This is where we part ways," she said, kneeling painfully to look into those amber eyes one last time. "You've given me more than I could ever explain. Now go. Be what you were born to be." Grayson stood motionless, watching her with that unnerving intelligence. "Go," Margaret said more firmly, pointing toward the forest. You're free. After a long moment, Grayson turned and trotted into the trees. At the edge of the forest, he paused, looking back once before disappearing into the shadows of the wild. The walk home was the loneliest of Margaret's life. The cabin felt hollow and silent without Grayson's presence. That night, she wept freely for the first time since Robert's death, mourning not just the wolf, but the extraordinary connection they had shared. Days passed, then weeks. Margaret returned to her solitary routines, trying to fill the absence Grayson had left. Sometimes she thought she heard howling in the distance, but told herself it was merely wishful thinking. One morning, nearly a month after their goodbye, Margaret stepped onto her porch with her morning tea and froze. There, at the edge of her clearing, stood Grayson. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood a sleek female wolf, watchful and wary. "Grayson?" Margaret whispered, scarcely believing her eyes. The male wolf approached confidently, while his companion remained at a cautious distance. He stopped at the porch steps, looking up at Margaret with familiar eyes. Margaret slowly descended the steps and knelt before him. Grayson pressed his forehead against hers for a brief moment, a gesture of recognition, of connection, before turning back toward his mate. "You found where you belong," Margaret said softly, "but you came back to let me know." 1 year after finding Grayson in the snow, Margaret's life had transformed completely. Her cabin had become an unofficial observation post for the local ranger district, her unique relationship with the wolf pack providing valuable research opportunities. Young wildlife biologist David Chen visited twice weekly, documenting the unprecedented bond between the elderly woman and the wild wolves. Grayson's pack now included 4 growing pups from his mating with the female wolf, whom Margaret had named Sierra. "They shouldn't trust humans this way," David remarked one morning as they watched the pack from Margaret's porch. "Yet they clearly distinguish between you and other people. It defies everything we understand about wolf behavior." "Maybe understanding has its limits," Margaret replied. "Some connections simply exist beyond explanation." The wolves never entered human territory except for Margaret's clearing. They remained wild hunters, wary of strangers, yet accepted Margaret as something neither human nor wolf, something unique. One crisp autumn morning, Margaret didn't appear on her porch at her usual time. Concerned after several unanswered calls, David drove to her cabin and found her in bed, weak but conscious. "Just tired," she insisted, though they both recognized the truth. At 79, Margaret's health had been declining steadily. "I'm calling an ambulance," David said firmly. "Not yet," Margaret replied. "Help me onto the porch first. I need to see them once more." David reluctantly helped her to her rocking chair on the porch. Within minutes, as if sensing something was wrong, Grayson appeared at the edge of the clearing. Alone this time, he approached the porch directly. "He knows," Margaret whispered. To David's astonishment, the wild wolf climbed the porch steps, something he had never done since returning to the wild, and settled at Margaret's feet, resting his massive head on her lap. She placed a trembling hand on his thick fur. "Thank you, old friend," she said softly. "We saved each other, didn't we?" When the ambulance arrived an hour later, Grayson retreated to the forest edge, but remained visible, watching as Margaret was taken away. In the hospital, doctors confirmed what Margaret already knew: her heart was failing. When she asked to return home for her final days, David arranged for hospice care at her cabin. On her last morning, Margaret asked to be helped onto the porch one final time. The entire wolf pack appeared in her clearing: Grayson, Sierra, and their growing pups, a silent tribute that left the hospice nurse speechless. Grayson approached alone, climbing the steps to settle beside Margaret's chair as he had done before. As the sun rose over the mountains they both loved, Margaret placed her hand on his head one last time. "Full circle," she whispered, "from saving to being saved." Margaret Wilson passed peacefully that afternoon. By her request, she was buried on her property, in the clearing where she had first found an injured wolf in the snow. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Share it with someone who loves inspiring stories, and help us spread messages of courage, compassion, and the extraordinary bonds that can form between the most unexpected souls.